This is kind of like the dark art of fine-tuning or training a model. And this is kind of like where we go from established science of there's one way to do this to the mad scientists that live on the fringes of open source. What most people have commonly found when training models is that...
And that was Keirsey. Kent is the founder and CEO of Invoke. He has been in the tech industry for over 14 years, serving as a product and business leader in startups across B2B, B2C, and enterprises. In 2022, he was an early contributor to Invoke's generative AI tools in open source, building solutions for professional creatives. Recognizing the need for this tool to serve teams, he founded Invoke in 2023 to provide image generation software for established creative teams and enterprises. During this conversation, we look at the pros and cons of consumer-grade GenAI tools.
That's how the emerging consumer AI tools typically work, is they offer some form of prompt expansion. But when you think about what that's doing, in some ways, that's creating a bias away from what the original intent is. Creatives that I know love Midjourney, but it's not controllable. And it's not really necessarily predictable so much as a very powerful creative slot machine.
What it takes to create a tool made for professional teams to solve specific creative challenges.
Invoke's core is a workflow engine, but again, the purpose is a little bit different. We're not building a workflow for a singular developer to build their own app. We're building the technology to allow that type of creative technologist to build a workflow for someone else.
The opportunities unlocked by a higher degree of control and customization of creative workflows.
We've seen customers train custom control nets. In our control net, the color red means this and the color blue means this, and anything on the middle of that spectrum is like navigating between those dimensions, right? And that's the type of stuff that gets really cool.
And we, of course, dive into some of the key issues faced by GenAI tools used for professional workflow, like the datasets used for the training, and of course, who owns the final product.
One of the things that's challenging is protectability of GenAI assets. This is where things get complicated because, like you said, there's different things that you can input to control the generation.
But before we get into it, I wanted to remind you that if you don't have the time to watch the full interview and want to learn from other founders and creatives at the intersection between XR and AI, you should definitely check out the XR AI Spotlight newsletter. By subscribing, you will get weekly interviews like this directly in your inbox and access to a list of tools and apps that allow you to experience Gaussian splatting in VR, on Quest, and Vision Pro. Just check the first link in the show description. And now it's time to roll the title and welcome Kent under the spotlight. Kent, it is a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Kent, we are going to talk and cover a lot about the role of AI and how creatives can harness it, how creatives are, let's say, reacting to it. But I wanted to start asking you, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that creatives have when they first try using GenAI in their process?
Ooh, biggest misconceptions. I think one that I commonly see is treating AI image generation like it's a chat bot or anthropomorphizing AI. And I think this is probably like a broader misconception that people have of how the tools work. I think ChatGPT has given everybody a little bit of a first impression of what they can expect from AI, but not all AI systems necessarily act like they are a assistant, right? And that is very much something that has been instilled or programmed into the ChatGPT model and many of the other open source AI models that have instruct at the end. When you're dealing with a raw model, it can behave very differently depending on how it was trained. And I think what we've been in the space since the early stages of the explosion around stable diffusion. And I think, the way that you're using those models is very much almost like it's almost like a prompt soup. You're basically putting descriptive words into it to have it kind of like figure it out and apply the texture to the generation. but I think a lot of misconceptions around how to engage with the tools and how to interact with them, and really seeing them as an assistant that's supposed to go do a task for you rather than a tool that operates a very specific way. And that, this kind of changes too. Every model's a little bit different. I think treating AI as if it is a unified tool that works the same way across models and across different applications, just treating it as kind of like one unified thing, is probably the biggest misconception. Is really just that standardization or homogenization of what AI can do.
But is this a model problem or an application problem? Because there are the two layers, right? So there is underlying model that generate the image, and then there is an application layer that allows you to do things. For example, let's say changes a part, select parts, or add text, or maybe use other sort of prompts that are just beyond text.
The problem is fundamentally at the model layer, primarily because the model layer is going to be where it learns the relationship between prompt and image, right? That's fundamentally where that relationship is constructed. The application layer can do things on top of that. If you go back to some of the early, popular models like DALL-E 2, for example, or Midjourney, if you look at Midjourney, one of the things that those applications do is they don't offer direct access to the model. They're constructing the prompt that is going to be eventually passed to the model for you, right? So you can see this in tools where you put a prompt in and a large language model takes that prompt and expands it and adds stuff to it and kind of basically says, I see what you were going for. Let me prompt for you so that we get something you'll like, right? Like that's how the emerging consumer AI tools typically work, is they offer some form of prompt expansion. But when you think about what that's doing, in some ways, that's creating a bias away from what the original intent is. And if you think about AI as a tool, the best tools are the ones where you have direct access to the tool and you know exactly which language will execute which tasks you want to use, right? And so when you think about the open source ecosystem of models and Stable Diffusion, SDXL, Flux, one of the reasons that is so popular among professionals is because you can train it, right? You can tune it to understand a new language, a new word, right? You can give it new context. And what you'll see people doing is they're creating their own tools using those models. They're adding new words, but they're not really more often than not, they're not just using the same standard words. They're kind of like code words, right? They've got numbers in them. They've got characters in them. They're kind of like new, novel ways of saying, I want you to do this specific thing. And they have direct access to the model and can prompt for that.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, I think this is kind of like the dark art of fine tuning or training a model, right? And this is kind of like where we go from established science of there's one way to do this to the mad scientists that live on the fringes of open source. But what most people have commonly found when training models is that if you try to use established words that are deeply kind of learned inside of the dictionary, so like cat, right? If you go and fine tune it on 1,000 images of cat, right, and you're showing it a new example of cat, what you're doing is you're competing with the existing understanding, right? You're arguing with the model. More often than not, if you're going to have 1,000 pictures of a cat, it's not going to be wildly different than the existing model's understanding. But hypothetically, let's say for you, cat is actually, I don't know, a three-legged dog, right? Like that's what cat means to you for whatever reason. You're just giving it that name, right? It's the dog's name is cat. If you're trying to override the existing token, you're fighting what's already there rather than just saying, hey, let's start from scratch. I'm going to show you my three-legged dog named Cat, but we're going to call him C4T. Okay. C4T is my dog. And now we're not competing with that established token. We're adding something new to the dictionary entirely. Now it doesn't have the base understanding. So it doesn't have cat to work from to kind of get a little bit of a head start, but it also isn't competing with anything. So you're really instructing it to work a certain way. And obviously people are doing all kinds of fine tuning, so that's not necessarily the only way to do it. But when you're adding new concepts, that's one way that people are finding they're able to kind of use language as a tool.
So let's say that I got this consciousness, right? In a sense that now the standard model, the one that are off the shelf, offer me this, let's say, flat solution, right? Where everything I lose the intent because the model itself is enriching my own prompt with this soup and taking away my own vision. Mm-hmm. What can I do as a creative to regain that in terms of strategies or in terms of other tools or in terms of training my own model?
Yeah, I guess maybe just to clarify that question, are you talking about when using closed source models, or are you talking about when using like open source tools and open source models?
Let's talk about open source first.
Okay. So open source models, typically, when you're running those models, unless you're using them in a hosted application that's doing that type of enrichment for you, they're not typically going to take your prompt and reinterpret it. What they're going to do is pass that through the text encoder and just pass it through the model and run it, right? They're basically taking your input conditioning and put it directly into the tool. The way that I would typically say, like, what you're fighting in those instances is not necessarily prompt enrichment. You're just fighting its interpretation of language. You might have a very specific understanding or vision of what a pitchfork looks like, and your pitchfork has 4 prongs and it goes this way and it kind of is shaped that way. There's a couple ways that you can get a model to generate your vision of a pitchfork, right? If you're just prompting pitchfork and it keeps coming back with 3 prongs, well, that's obviously, there's not really a good way to like get around its understanding of pitchfork. But you can use a number of different additional inputs now in open source models that'll allow you to control that. So one of the early open source, I would say probably maybe most important one that came out of the early research around Stable Diffusion was a model called ControlNet. And what ControlNet did was it had a sidecar machine learning model that would inject conditioning that would shape the structure of the image. And what that meant was you could pass in a sketch, you could pass in a 3D rendering, you could pass in a pose, and the models would understand what that was intending to control for, whether that was like the exact edges of the resulting image or the 3D depth or the pose, right? And it would kind of require the AI model to color inside the lines, right? And so in that case, you could actually say, this is the shape of the pitchfork that I want, and it's a pitchfork. And so it's kind of like, okay, I have got to color inside the lines, and it's also a pitchfork. I'm going to take these 2 concepts of the shape here and the concept of a pitchfork, and I'm going to kind of apply it to that. And that's how you really wrest control over these models, is by injecting additional inputs and controls, whether that's at the model layer where you're customizing it or these like sidecar injection mechanisms.
And of course, I think it makes total sense in a sense. It's hard to believe that for an actual professional workflow, you would just rely on a text. You always need this stronger control based on an original image that then is processed, and you can loosen up that control. You can tighten it up depending on what was also the input. But then it's hard to believe that you would just use text. Now, you also mentioned, what about, can you regain control with the mid journeys, with the let's say non-open source model? Can you do something about it?
You certainly can. I think they have a couple of commands that will allow you to prompt raw into the model that it kind of basically takes away some of that enrichment. I think that the challenge with that is arguably it becomes very difficult to understand how to then prompt those models, because so much of their effort has been in translating what you want into a pretty picture, that's why people use Midjourney, is because it's able to do that type of enrichment, right? And you don't have to try, you don't have to work at it to get a good picture out of it. You just kind of throw in some words and it'll turn that into something great, right? So I don't know that that's its purpose. I don't know that that's where Midjourney's best kind of use case is right now, is for creative control and exactness. I think Midjourney has one of the best models for aesthetic quality, for style, and for being able to explore the latent space of possibility with a guide and a Sherpa, if you will. That's kind of what Midjourney does for you, is it guides you through that space so you don't have to learn the intricacies of it yourself. But invariably, like you won't ever really understand how it works behind the scenes, because that's not something that is in Midjourney's interest to share with you. That's their secret sauce, right? That is why people pay for Midjourney. So I think it's got a place, and a lot of creatives that I know love Midjourney. They love the aesthetic inspiration it can provide. It is a very creative model, but it's not controllable, and it's not really necessarily predictable so much as a very powerful creative slot machine, right? It's like a very useful tool in that way, but it's for ideation and for inspiration more than it is like I'm creating the exact image I wanted.
So now, as the founder of Invoke, right? So what I'm curious about is, if we look at a place where you have very little control, as you imagine, like Midjourney, like this ChatGPT, and the other side where you have Comfy UI, right? Where you have this tightly refined control. Could you explain us where does Invoke sits, and how does that differentiate and position within a creative workflow, and how, for who is it as well in terms of creatives?
So I would put Invoke, if you've got Comfy on one end and the consumer UIs on the other, I would put Invoke closer to the Comfy side of the equation. But it's a step earlier before you're like at bare metal. Like the step after Comfy is you're writing your own scripts, right? I mean, it's as close as you can get to writing code without actually having to write code. It's kind of a step above that. Some people have described Comfy as a visual IDE, right? It's like a developer environment, but it's a visual developer environment. So it's a lot more technical, but it's not the direct writing of scripts, even though a lot of people who use Comfy also write their own custom nodes and are injecting that in and just using it as an interface for orchestrating that. Invoke is really, originally built around the idea that there's a better interface for 90% of the workflows that people are building in Comfy, right? A lot of what people end up doing in Comfy is building miniature state machines for managing an application for themselves, right? It's like I've got conditionals that'll turn this feature on or turn this off, and I'm kind of using it almost as like a pseudo application for myself where I can kind of get what I need. Invoke is much more opinionated in that regard, in the sense that it has a canvas and it integrates all of those things that you might turn off or turn on, rather than as controllable like nodes in a graph as part of the interface itself. We're adding layers. We're adding layers to a canvas, and we're kind of manipulating those common controls like ControlNet, IP adapter, and so on and so forth as visual representations on a canvas. It abstracts the workflow away. But underneath Invoke's core is a workflow engine. We're a workflow engine as well, and we offer that same kind of flexibility. But again, the purpose is a little bit different. We're not building a workflow for a singular developer to build their own app. We're building the technology to allow that type of creative technologist to build a workflow for someone else, right? So orchestrating that pipeline and building that workflow, but then building a small user interface around that, allowing for certain things to be exposed to the end user, or exposing that as an API on our hosted product. Like we're enabling them to provide access to that workflow using an interface. And that's really where I would say like Invoke's job relative to Comfy is adding the interface layer on top of that for people who want to be a little bit more on the creative side and closer to the creative piece of it.
So can you explain me one thing? So you mentioned that creating this interface for other people, right? Mm-hmm. So, and maybe I haven't understood this correctly, but so would you say that with Invoke, is that for the creating themselves to build, or is for people that know how the system works so that other creatives within their team can then leverage what was built by the more technically skilled? Like
all of those people, right? Okay. So like the way to think about, at least what we have found, is that you have a creative technologist who is super close to the raw understanding of what the models do, what they're used for, and how they can go about doing it. And you kind of see two flavors there. One of those is building pipelines to solve specific problems inside of the organization, right? One of those is basically building like a workflow to solve a business problem or a creative task. We want to build this thing, right? And that person very often is a very small minority inside the company who have that expertise, right? You've got one crazy guy who spends his nights and weekends playing around with this stuff, and he's like the AI guy that everyone's like, oh yeah, ask him, you know. And that I've seen that pattern I've seen over and over again where they're super enthusiastic about it and they love workflows, they love Comfy, but everyone else on their team is like, we can't use this. I have no idea what are you showing me? I don't want to look at
Yeah.
this thing, right? Like this
And then
is
you see
not.
these people, and then you see these people that open Comfy UI. Come on, it's easy. Look, you just connect this and
Uh-huh.
this. Like, come on, man. What are you
Yeah.
saying?
It's the curse of knowledge, right? Which is like, hey, look, everyone's gonna love this. This is the future. And I think, the reality is I would love to believe that everyone's going to be as enthusiastic as I am about this stuff, right? And as others that are like Comfy enthusiasts are going to be. But the reality is, like, when you go into a team and especially like creative teams at scale, a lot of people just want to create. They don't want to have to fight the technology. They want it to work with them. They want it to be like a native experience. And so the question that you're left with is, as a creative technologist who's dealing with these workflows, are we going and building our own application? And there's certainly some teams who do that, right? They're like, okay, well, we've got the workflow and we're going to do this application on top of it. It's either a simple Gradio application or we've got an R&D team and we're going to find all of the ways we think it should be integrated into our workflow. Or we're going to integrate it into the other tools in our pipeline. Like if you're a VFX studio, maybe you've got Nuke and you want to integrate that in, right? Like there's a whole host of opportunities and there's a place for Comfy UI in the world. Like I think everyone knows that Comfy UI is wildly, it got very passionate enthusiasts behind it. When you start getting into the deployment problems of running this technology at scale and the cost of keeping up with the latest in model development and capabilities and thinking through the user experience around using those, that's where we solve that problem. That's what we do. We've built the application. We're enthusiast about it, so we can think about the the super fun questions that take 3 to 4 weeks to figure out, which is what is the right way to expose this to a creative that isn't like convoluted and broken in like some workflow. Like, how do we expose this in an easy to use way? That takes time. It takes a lot of like emerging kind of like what problems are people running into, how can we solve those for them. So I'll give you an example. Control nets came out in 2023. We released support for those, but the problem we observed with control nets, especially on Invoke's canvas, is that a control net, you pass in one image, and this is how a lot of the consumer tools work as well, is you pass in one image and you don't really get much of a visualization of where inside of the image that's going to impact the generation. And you don't really see how multiple controls are going to overlap or impact each other. You don't see where they line up. You also don't have the ability to edit those. If the pre-processors pick up kind of weird artifacts or things like that, and our canvas is very iterative. So you're going in and not just generating the whole image. You might be wanting to edit the face or going in and drawing in new things that you're then transforming using AI. And when you're working on different parts of the image, you need that control image to kind of stay where it is and allow you the flexibility of working on smaller regions or larger regions. So all of that led to us really coming to the conclusion that, oh, well, control images should be a layer on a canvas, and we should be able to see that and turn it on or turn it off. It's kind of like an overlay and work with it, right? Like work with it on the canvas. And that was kind of like the first evolution of that type of tool. No one's ever done that. I'm still not familiar with anybody who's done that degree of interaction on the control layers piece. And that just came from us being like at the forefront, playing around with it and solving the like UX problem of what's the ideal experience for someone who knows what they're doing. Now, that's not to say that most people do know what they're doing. And that's why I say, like, when you think about the experimentation and the learning that's needed to learn the tool, the canvas is not the novice tool. It's not the tool that somebody comes in and says, oh, this is easy. That problem is solved by someone building a workflow and presenting a small user interface that says, put in a prompt, put in your sketch. Here's one slider you get control over. That's it. You get nothing else. And they have basically if you go to the bowling alley, they put up the guardrails and you also get that thing where you push the ball down a ramp. That's like the workflow experience they get is like very much on the rails. It does this one job and you can load up whatever workflow you want, but that's what you're going to get. Once you get familiar with the tools, you fall either into the builder camp of I'm going to go build workflows for other people, I think like an engineer, or I'm now an AI powered creative and I want to use this on a canvas and I want to be able to switch on and off whatever tools I want, but on a canvas because I'm focusing on a creative piece. And that's kind of like the evolution into that world.
So you mentioned deploying this AI at scale, right? And I imagine that there are several challenges around it. Before getting into it, I have one more question. Like, can you make some of these workflows from that teams are using a bit more tangible for us? Can you give us some example of how this workflow look like, maybe in different fields? It could be like maybe someone's producing images for social media or maybe VFX. Can you break us down a couple of workflow?
Yeah. So one of the most common ones is going to be a very simple sketch to image workflow, right? And, I think this is where the integration of custom models comes in. So, I mentioned earlier that you might have a custom model that you've trained with a code word, right? Your secret sauce, and it understands that word. Well, then you have to think about, okay, well, we've trained that custom model. It's got a secret word. How do we make sure that everyone knows that secret word and knows how to use it and knows the exact pipeline that we intended for that LoRa or that model to work inside of? And what you end up concluding is we don't really want to have to teach people all of this arcane language. We want to just kind of bake it in. And so let's say, for example, you're a game studio and you have a very specific aesthetic and you've trained that into the model. You trained it on all of your old games. You have a very specific mobile game style, or it's like super cool, high fantasy 3D-esque style, whatever it is. You train that into a model and you have a bunch of prompt terms that will elicit a style that is exactly what is in line with that game. You're going to build a workflow that takes the user prompt and adds all of that stuff in so the user doesn't have to think about it. It's going to add the LoRa in. It's going to pick the right model. It's going to use all of the right style terms. All you're asking the user to do is type in what you want to see. What's the subject matter that you want to see? Don't worry about learning the 50 words you need to add to this to get the right style or learn what a model is. Just type in your prompt. And that's like the basic workflow is we're doing the thinking for you of selecting some of the variables that are a little bit harder to understand as a noob, right? That's like a standard one. If you get into more evolved workflows, like the high end of R&D, where people are really, really into this stuff, you can get into some really cool workflows. So we've seen customers train custom control nets, right? Where you're not just dealing with the basic, here's a sketch or here's a 3D block out, but like in our control net, the color red means this and the color blue means this. And anything on the middle of that spectrum is like navigating between those dimensions, right? And we trained a model to understand that and control this our way. And that's the type of stuff that gets really cool. You can also do very dynamic workflows. So one of the workflows that we released in the application a few weeks ago, as part of the default set of templates. So we come with like a bunch of workflows that you can use out of the box that are kind of specific to industries. One of them allows you to type in a word and it will automatically find that using the segment anything model from Meta. It'll go in, it'll find that object that you've typed, it will mask it, and it will allow you to replace that or reprompt that without having to go in and do anything. So it's basically a word-based search for masking and in-painting a region. And you can use that to say, hey, touch up the face, touch up the dress, touch up the shoes, whatever it is, it's going to go in, it's going to find that object, and it's going to allow you to regenerate that. And then it will composite that back into the whole image. And so those types of workflows are really cool because they get really dynamic. They're using other AI models to identify not just what do I want to see, but where am I editing and what part of the image am I editing? And it's doing segmentation and that kind of stuff. And that's where you get into like really powerful workflows, but all of that's done dynamically at runtime, depending on what the user's asking for.
Yeah, and of course the advantage is that this is all automated, right? So then you could do this for hundreds, thousands of images, and that's the extra edge that you get with all this.
That's right. So you mentioned built those use cases and you built those pipelines, then that becomes a repeatable unlock for the team. And I think one of the challenges that most organizations have right now is, this technology exists today, but people don't know how to use it in the context of the work that they're doing. And I think that's probably true across many like industries and applications of AI. Is like the technology is magic. And if we stopped developing new models today, we would still be figuring it out for 5 to 10 years. Like people would still take that long to figure it out. That's the big challenge. And so as an organization, when you're starting to think about, okay, we need to deploy this, that's why it's incredibly important to say, okay, we know what use cases we want to do, and we're going to build workflows that solve that problem so that we can start getting value today and unlocking use case by use case, so that we can kind of begin to accelerate in that direction rather than just kind of like flounder.
And yet there are many organizations and teams that also rightfully are still waiting or holding on due to our all other series of problems, right? Copyrights being one and many more. So how do you address that at Invoke?
Specifically the other barriers and other hurdles.
So let's imagine we're talking about copyrights, right? Sure. So we have this model. It is not sure how this model was trained. Are we infringing copyrights? Are we not? And that is one of the, let's say, objection that comes. And I think it's fair. How do you address those? You as answering, but also as a tool itself?
Yeah. So as a tool, we are model agnostic. We don't have a model. We're not offering a model. We allow you to bring your model, and we have compatibility with a number of the leading models, right? So if the organization wants a free model, right, one that's truly like free and open and they can train on top of it and not have to pay anybody access, you've got Stable Diffusion, you got SDXL, you have a whole host of models, right? If you want the best quality that's trainable right now, you're probably looking at Black Forest Labs Flux. We work with Flux. If you're looking for risk to be mitigated, if you're worried about copyright on the training of the model and you care about that and you want to kind of be able to stand by the model that you're using for your team or for your customers, we partner with a company called Bria, and Bria offers a fully indemnified model that was trained on licensed data, and they pay through an attribution engine that we run on behalf of our customers. They pay the people that they license the data from on a regular basis, right? That's part of their business model is attributing that and paying them back. And so for us, we're trying to provide the best experience and the set of tools that allow you to use it, but we help address that problem by allowing you to choose whatever model is going to solve the problems that you run into as a business, whether that's risk or whether that's quality. Bria is also fully fine-tunable as well, so you can train it on your stuff. It takes a little bit more training, I would say, to get to where you need it to get to, but it's a very, very powerful model in that regard. When it comes to the outputs of these models, one of the things that's challenging is protectability of GenAI assets. And 2023, the U.S. Copyright Office made it pretty clear in a lot of their determinations that you weren't going to get a copyright on any outputs of a generative AI model where you didn't have substantial and significant contributions of human creativity. And specifically what they delineated is that prompting does not constitute that. Prompting does not constitute human creativity. And I could probably spend like 100 years on this subject and
Yeah,
kind of
maybe just a little bit prompting. How, in a sense, like also a sketch could be a prompt in a way,
well,
right?
that's it's an interesting definition, right? So specifically, what they were referring to as a text prompt. So text to image, text to anything.
Okay.
If you ask ChatGPT to write you a book, you don't get a copyright on the book based on your prompt, right? Um, this is where things get complicated because, like you said, there's different things that you can input to control the generation. And there have been a couple of like tests and experiments. If you put in a sketch, the first real evidence and test of this was a woman by the name of Chris Castanova. Created an art piece called Rose Enigma. And she had a sketch that she passed into Stable Diffusion's ControlNet technology. And it showed like I was able to control this and it generated it and it looks like my sketch, right? Um, the Copyright Office said you get a copyright on the sketch. So you get a copyright on the sketch that you drew. And because you have a copyright on that, anything that is a human perceptible derivative, like an AI output that is using that as a control image, you can claim copyright on the human perceptible elements in that output, but you don't get a copyright on the final image itself. That is what they said. This gets complicated because you're like, okay, what does that mean? Like, what does that practically mean? I think practically what that means is you're probably safe from somebody copying that image because it is kind of a derivative of your original sketch in a lot of ways, right? Like it's the human perceptible elements exist in that resulting image. And even if that image doesn't itself have a copyright, you're still protected because you have the original copyright on the sketch, right? So there's a little bit of like, I don't know, I get cross-eyed trying to think about like, what does that mean? What Invoke demonstrated earlier this year, and I would say that this is partly, I would claim that the sketch is, I would argue, the better example of controllability over AI and should merit a copyright. Like I believe that's true. And I would argue for increased protection when you have that type of human creativity involved. I think everything else is like a weird technicality on the US Copyright Office's part. But I digress. What we demonstrated, and this is again through like understanding uh, where the Copyright Office was arguing from and basically trying to say, okay, well, if we're going to play that game, we know where that line is and we know where we can get a copyright. And what we argued was there's this notion of selection, arrangement, and coordination, which is to say, if I was an artist and I took a bunch of magazine pictures and I cut them up and I made a new piece of art from all of that, collage art, right? I can actually claim a copyright on the resulting work, right? I can claim a copyright on that collage. That's selection and arrangement. I've created something new by taking parts and transforming it. Well, the argument that we made is that by using Invoke's canvas and by doing iterations and changing parts of the image and adding and editing and so on and so forth, that over the course of doing that, that's the exact same thing we're doing. We're selecting and arranging and compositing a new image. Now, that image is entirely constituted of AI generated outputs that we prompted for, but that still meets that bar of selection or arrangement. And that's where my human creativity came from. And the Copyright Office eventually relented in January of 24 this year, or last, no, 25, January of 25 this year, that was the case. And we got the copyright on the resulting image because there's nothing else to get a copyright on but the resulting image in that case, right? And that's a little bit of like the technicalities and the dance around this stuff that's still going on, but that effectively put to bed the question of can we protect work that comes out of these tools? The question that still remains is to what extent does that protection matter, and what do we need to be doing in order to feel comfortable? Because even if we got that answer, it's not exactly been tested yet to have some big game publisher have their core IP copied and then them litigate that in court and say these are the parts that were AI, these are the parts that we did. Like there's risk there still because it's still not settled case law. So that's kind of maybe the long-winded way of saying it's complicated, but we are trying to provide answers on all fronts as it pertains to using the technology in a professional capacity. We're trying to provide answers to those, whether it's on the inputs, on the outputs, and where the tool enables that.
So we have discussed, we mentioned a couple of time game studios, right? That are, of course, some of the teams that are, let's say, adopting this first compared to VFX or compared to others. So in your experience, right, if we maybe take also even a step back from just purely image generation, how are currently studios using GenAI in their processes, and which are the one? Because there is always this feeling like indie studios are much more progressive, they are using much more compared to bigger studios. What is your experience about it?
I would definitely say indie studios are using it much more than the big studios in the sense of, if you think about the pipeline end to end, you've got the early concepting, prototyping, ideation, like the early stuff. You've got the kind of like asset generation pipeline and kind of the stuff in the middle. And then you've got the launch and marketing and live ops and all that kind of stuff, right? You've got like this whole life cycle of a game. The big studios are much more risk averse, and they have IP that's worth a lot more. It's established IP. It's not some new idea. It's like, oh, this thing's been printing money for a decade and we don't want to put the golden goose at risk, right? And so bigger studios are definitely earlier in the adoption curve insofar as like actually putting it into production pipelines in games and making that the way that they do it, right? I would say the way to think about where they're adopting it is very much earlier in the process. Like earlier in the process, the earlier you get, the more and more it's being experimented with and used and allowed to be used. The closer you get to the end game and the customer, the more it has additional hurdles it needs to clear. Some organizations are fine using open source models that were trained on everything under the sun, primarily because their assessment of the risk is we just need to make sure that we're not prompting for infringing materials, right? As long as we're controlling it with a sketch and we're using a prompt that doesn't say like copyright character name,
Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse, although the original Mickey Mouse, the OG Mickey Mouse, is now public domain. As long as we're not doing that, we're in the clear. And other companies are basically like, we just don't even know and we don't want to touch it, but we're okay using the clean models like Bria, and we're okay deploying those. And that's where you get the entire spectrum of risk appetite and what they're comfortable with, and where you really need to meet them in the middle and on kind of delivering that. Indie studios are a lot more like, hey, we got to make a game. We got to make it as cheap as possible. We got to print this game out. Let's go, right? And I think you see that in some sense, maybe overused by indies. A lot of indies are looking to replace the artist in the process and rely on completely AI generated assets. And I think the games suffer as a result. I think you can tell when it hasn't really been crafted with a creative's eye and kind of the aesthetic and design sensibilities. I mean, anything that's not really curated by a creative or a designer, you can tell, it's just very clear. But the best, and maybe the most like heavy adoption I would see from a professional perspective, where it's like not an indie, but it is still getting very significantly adopted, is probably in mobile gaming right now. I think mobile gaming has a not a lower bar, but they have a different medium that they're working with, a different context. They're working on a mobile device, and so the assets aren't really going into Unreal Engine in full 3D, and so the assets can be made for the final game directly in an AI generated capacity, right? And if you do bring in the artists into the fold, like one of our biggest customers has 70, 80 artists using the tool regularly in their creative process. And that's just the nature of how they're building the game is they've got that as part of their pipeline now, but they have custom models. They're very controllable. They're very tunable in that way. And that's kind of where you see the adoption is kind of purpose built to the industry and the nature of the game pipeline.
So when you look at these indie studios, right, what are some of the mistakes that you see them doing? And maybe what advice would you give them when they are trying different tools? Because again, using GenAI means so many things,
Yep.
right? At so many steps. It goes from the model, maybe the rigging, the animations, it could be the sound, it could be so many things, right?
Yeah.
So from a let's say high level perspective, are there some common mistakes that the studios make, and what advice would you give?
I mean, my if I were to start an indie game studio right now, I think the context that you're starting in is much different than 5 years ago, right? We are in an increasingly an environment where indie games have a hard time breaking out, right? There is more content today than there has ever been, and with the advent of Gen AI, that problem is just increased even more because more and more people are creating games, right? They're coming up with like they're vibe coding their way into a game, right? Um, the way that I would think about this strategically is how do you make something that people will play? How do you break out in that context? And the answer is not let's go use the exact same AI model that everyone else is using to produce their game assets with no creative control and no guidance whatsoever. We're just going to use those outputs in our game. That's the path towards mediocrity. That's the path towards looking exactly like every other game out there. And you can maybe get away with it if your game mechanics and the core game loop that you're building is wildly unique and nobody's ever done it before, and you're like serving a niche that really has an itch it wants to scratch. Like, you could probably get away with it there, but almost always you're better off engaging a creative to participate in that process. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go hire an artist onto the team full time. There are, I think, emerging ways of interacting with creatives. So I gave a talk at South by Southwest earlier this year, and I was on stage with Paul Trillo, who is probably one of the earliest AI filmmakers, probably like a defining AI filmmaker. He's one of the earliest ones that has produced stuff that really stands out and is unique, and I would say embraces the technology the way it needs to be embraced. One of the things that he did recently was they created a video using an artist's style by engaging that artist, writing a contract that says, we're going to train a model for this project and this project alone. We're going to train a model on your style, and you're going to help us make sure that it is aesthetically aligned with what you would do. Because he's got a very specific stippling effect he does. He's got a very specific aesthetic. They went through the process and they were able to generate an entire 3D world of assets, like hundreds and hundreds of assets, without having to manually create each of those, but in that exact style, because they engaged that artist and that creative. And I think that's where there's a really interesting opportunity if you're an indie, is finding an artist who's willing to explore that with you and doing that creative ideation and design and direction and training the model so that you're not generating a mediocre aesthetic or output. I think that's the thing that I would really encourage. I've got other opinions on like market stuff, but yeah, I'll let you ask the question.
There is just one thing, because this gets a little bit philosophical as well. In a sense, now, what's the artist's role then? Now that the model is being created, right? Well, as an artist, at the moment that I'm out, I'm finished.
And this is why contract scope is incredibly important, right? For an artist, there's a couple of ways that I think you could engage in that type of relationship. One would be you as an artist train your own model, right? You train it on your style, you train it and you give instructions and you license that. You say, I will give you a license to my model for a year, and you can use it for a year. And next year we'll renegotiate. We'll talk about what you can do with it, right? I'll charge you $3,000 to use my model and generate whatever assets you want with it. It's a really good model. Let me show you, right? You're as an artist, you're now licensing that technology that you've created for yourself. I think that increasingly will be something that is valuable. We've already seen that happen for a number of kind of like model trainers who used to make their models open source that have moved to selling those models because there's such significant demand for high quality models. The other is I'm engaging with you as a contractor to help you develop a style for this game, right? We're going to create a visual aesthetic for this game. And if you use the trained model that came out of this process, you can use it for the purposes of this game for this price. Like we're going to engage in a one-time contract. If we do another game, if we do the next game, the sequel, whatever, we have to engage in a new contract. We have to engage in a new project where we come in and we take it to the next level. We push it further. We work together again. Or maybe we just reuse the same model and you just pay me like an extension or whatever. And we do that. Like, but there's some relationship there that will come from this. And I mean, probably what you really want, if you want to push for like the highest quality, is you're not just taking a model and producing stuff with a prompt. You're engaging with the artist and they're helping you create assets and stuff that's interesting, because that's the best quality. But like, if we're going to go through from one end of the spectrum to the other, I think that's purely viable as a possibility, but allows you to be different from the base model. Again, I think like standing out is the hard part right now in the market. And if we're talking to indie game developers, I think one of the stats that came out of a report last year was that 60 to 70% of playtime in like all logged hours of people playing games is going to games that were released 6 years ago or more, right? 60 to 70%. And that's not sequels, that's not franchises, that's another chunk of that like 100%. 60 to 70% is on games that have existed for 6+ years. That includes Fortnite, that includes Minecraft, that includes all those games that have an ecosystem and a platform that people are locked into like a black hole for entertainment, right? If you're trying to make an indie game, you're doing one of two things. You're building on one of those platforms. You're doing it inside Fortnite. You're creating new games, but using the Fortnite UEFN or something like that. Or you're competing for that sliver of the market that is new players playing a game or players playing a new IP that's never existed before, that's not a sequel, it is completely novel. And if you're trying to capture that portion of the market, you increasingly have to be different on meaningful dimensions. I believe that that's probably the visual aesthetic. So you can imagine the exact same game flopping because it looks bad versus it scratches the itch of the players and it's kind of aligned with the cultural zeitgeist. Like you can imagine in like the early 2000s when everyone was going crazy about vampires, you had like a vampire themed game and had a really cool vampire look, like everyone would lose their mind, right? And it's because you have like this alignment of the theme and the visuals and what people are attracted to at that moment in time in the culture. You have to do that in order to stand out, but you also have to make sure that that core gameplay loop is particularly focused, right? You can't be a mass market. You're not going to capture everyone's interest. You got to focus on like who is underserved and where is there a real market. That might be like, there's a lot of roguelikes right now where people are experimenting with that because people have like 20 or 30 minutes. They don't have the same time they used to. They're in their late 30s. They used to be a gamer. They still want to be a gamer, but they don't have 50 hours to play a game. They have 20 minutes. And they want
That
to come
looks
in
familiar.
and pitch out. Yeah, I mean, I know that need. I know that need desperately, right? I've got like no time. And that's why there's like an emerging roguelike scene, is because you can build a core loop that's short. It's kind of fun and dynamic because it's changing all the time. And you just have to figure out what is the exact genre that's going to be like new and different enough that people will play it. And you put that together with a really cool aesthetic and a cool story and a cool theme. And now you've got something that stands out. And that's really, even with that, you're still you still have long odds of great success, right? But you have to do those things to even have a chance, right? And that's not going to come from you just prompting a model saying, give me a cool character that's like a knight in mobile game style. It's going to look like garbage.
Kent, I am afraid that we could go on for quite a long time, but
Yep.
I think it was like I love the conversation, and thank you very much for everything you have shared. I'm pretty sure that people should check out Invoke. I think it is like this extra control and layers on top of what they're already building, and with a bit of easy of use than the comfy UI that to me looks still very scary. So thank you very much, Kent, for joining in.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening in. If you like the show, remember to leave a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a thumbs up on YouTube. It really helps me keep doing this and shine the spotlights on the greatest founders and makers, pushing the boundaries of XR and AI. Also, make sure to check out the show page xraispotlight.com, where you can find more conversation like this one. Till next time.